Presume that we're waiting until 5 past or so before we start, correct?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Okay, let's give it another minute or so and then we can start. Okay, I think we can start. It's 5 past. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's penultimate lecture in the series on advanced political economy by SOAS in the New School for Social Research in New York. The speaker today, it's a great pleasure for me to say, is Ying Chen, who is Associate Professor of Political Economy at the New School. Ying works on the direction of capitalism and its development. She's particularly interested in development questions broadly, but also labor within that. And obviously climate. And her focus has long been on the global south. So today she's going to talk to us on the climate crisis and the contradictions of capitalism that this has given rise to. She will speak for 40 minutes, 3/4 of an hour, whatever it is. And then we will have discussion in the usual way in which these lectures have been conducted. So without any further ado, I will give the floor to Ying, and I will go quiet.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kostas, for introduction, and thank you to all the audience today also that spent the time to come to hear some of my thoughts on the current climate change question. So Given the current severity of the climate crisis and the largely lagged responses to address the crisis, many are now saying that it's probably easier to imagine the end of the humanity, the end of the human being and the earth that we inhabit, rather than to envision the end of capitalism. And so I wanted to discuss why this is the case, why this pessimism that we are observing now, both in the academia and also in the climate activism. So I'm planning to discuss first the various approaches to understanding the climate crisis and show how some of the economic ideas, and particularly those influenced by neoclassical economics, the mainstream economics, got us into the current stalemate we're in, and why the radical political economy approach is really crucial for us to understand the root cause of the climate change crisis and help us to find a way to get out of it. Among all, I will highlight three approaches, as you can see on screen. Environmental economics, which I see it as being heavily influenced by the mainstream neoclassical economics. And it is an approach that firmly believes in the power of the market to deliver the so-called best outcome, the most efficient outcome. The second approach, ecological economics, which takes a more comprehensive framework and a more holistic view towards the climate question based on ecological science, and largely sees human society as being part of the ecosystem, and therefore does not, like the environmental economics or like the neoclassical economics, prioritize economic growth, and particularly economic growth measured by GDP. And the third approach, political economy approach, which is another broad umbrella for, I would say, and sometimes we call it heterodox economics, that launches critique to neoclassical economics. But today I'm going to talk about some approaches within the political economy tradition that takes a class perspective and holds a very strong concern with well-being, with economic justice, and with climate justice. So this is what I wanted to talk about spend most of the time discussing. And of course, I'm going to give some examples on how these approaches analyze the questions that we're facing today and their proposed solutions, and also introduce some of the debates among these different school of thoughts. So I'm going to start with the environmental economics approach. So basically, as I said, environmental economics theoretically originated and therefore is very much compatible with neoclassical economics. The typical proposals you would hear from this school of thought is that environmental destruction is an externality of economic activities, and externality occurs because firms are making decisions based on cost-benefit analysis, but they didn't calculate the cost well, or the government didn't intervene enough, for instance, right, to make sure that the social costs are also being calculated. So the key point here is still that market would work perfectly as long as we find the correct pricing of every goods that are being sold in the market, right? So therefore the solution is to find the correct price. And that's why we hear proposals such as carbon trade mechanism, which basically saying that, okay, we need to make carbon more expensive, right? And therefore, in using that way to disincentivize firms to use carbon intensively, right? And therefore use that incentive mechanism to contribute to the carbon reduction effort. As I said, this effort to correct carbon price is based on the neoclassical economic school of thought that can be traced back to earlier works in the late 19th, actually, and early 20th. Two major pillars of the neoclassical economics. First is that economy is about people coming to the market to exchange commodities, and therefore the exchange is more important. The exchange market is more important. Everyone comes to the market as equals, right? Although some goes to the market to sell their labor, some has their capital, has their initial endowment that is completely different from others, but that doesn't matter. Everyone is seen as being equal when they're making exchanges in the market, and they're making voluntary exchanges, right? So for this approach, the production process is not relevant at all, and therefore labor and the exploitation of labor that takes place mostly during the production process was not part of the discussion at all. Based on this understanding, the ideological implication is that capitalism, which is a system that heavily based on market exchange, is therefore the most efficient system, right? So in that sense, we can also argue that the neoclassical theory, by ignoring the social power of people engaging in these exchange activities, is also extremely ideological in the sense of being defensive of the capitalist ideology, although the discipline itself always claims to be value-free, always claims to be neutral. How is the price determined? Because for neoclassicals, the most important solution is to find the correct price to carbon, or to find the most correct price for pollution, and therefore we can use the market mechanism to basically cure the issue, right? Then how is price determined? So far, the literature doesn't have an agreement on the so-called correct pricing of carbon. As I show here, you can see that there's a wide range of proposals of what is claimed to be the correct pricing, from $1 to $200 per metric tons. And this is because economists and scholars try to find out this correct pricing by constructing models with some assumptions, some arbitrary assumptions, right? Assumptions about, say, how do they think the pace of the technological innovation could be, right? How do they think energy demand would change in response to rising energy prices, right? These are all important assumptions that are built into the model, but each scholars have very different views on that, and therefore, just by changing a few of these assumptions, you will get very different results. So far we don't really have an agreement on what the correct price is. In reality, the average global carbon price right now is only $3 per ton, which is way below the recommended $75 to $100 needed to achieve the Paris Agreement target. To this, the neoclassical economists responded by saying that what we need to do is to implement more stringent regulation and rules of carbon market to lower the amount of the permit and to make sure that the prices don't fall ineffective low, or to implement more serious punishment, right? So that people who are not really obeying these policies will be disincentivized, will be punished. And third, to impose the so-called border tax, which means everyone is facing the same kind of price for carbon in all across the global borders, so that there's no carbon price arbitrage. So basically, capital cannot really flood to regions with relatively low carbon price. So again, this is a very typical neoclassical way of thinking, right? To make sure the market works perfectly, but still let market be the dominant logic to coordinate the economy, right? As we can see, this is far from being reached, and so far, therefore, we're still in this kind of stalemate and see a lot of a carbon trade mechanism not being extremely effective at all. But the point here is to trace it back to the theoretical anchor of the neoclassical economics, which is to find the correct price. Another important proposal from the neoclassical economics is so-called environmental Kuznets curve. So this is actually a little bit earlier than what we see today about the carbon trade mechanism. This is the time when economists can still explain away pollution, explain away climate change as a problem, where basically the argument is that as long as the economy keeps growing, there's always going to be some technological innovation to help us conquer this problem of pollution. And therefore, just like the Kuznets curve that was used to explain the relationship between growth and inequality, we can also use the same relationship to explain the relationship between growth and pollution, which means that in the beginning, when economy is rapidly developing, we're going to be expecting to see a lot of pollution and environmental issues. But as long as the economy keeps growing, eventually there's going to be new methods coming up to solve the problem, right? So this we don't hear too much now because the empirical evidence really is suggesting the opposite. And even for some countries, for a handful of countries, mostly in the global north camp, that shows some effective improvement of their energy efficiency. For instance, scholars have pointed out that it was largely due to carbon leakage, meaning that progressive policies within the global north and the consequential improved results of ecological sustainability, right, can be largely explained by the outsourcing of the most polluting industries to the global south. Therefore, on the whole, from the global perspective, the climate change issue is still not sufficiently addressed. So this is basically from the theoretical core to the reasoning to the conclusion and proposal of the environmental economics that is heavily influenced by neoclassical ideas. Ecological economics, as I said, takes a more holistic view. It doesn't just focus on markets. It does view human being as part of the ecosystem. And therefore, for them, GDP growth, economy growth, is not an imperative. I mean, of course, there are different variants of ecological economics, but I'm going to today focus on the variant of ecological economics that actually proposes this idea of degrowth. What is important to point out is that for ecological economists, they are proposing degrowth out of a very pragmatic observation, which means that it does not start with a critique of the system. It does not start with the critique of the logic of capital, for instance. That is a sharp difference from the political economy approach that I'm going to in a minute. So it starts from a pragmatic observation that reducing material throughput, basically reducing the energy use, the resource use, is needed for addressing climate crisis. And the reasoning process is that based on empirical evidence, 1% of GDP growth in global income requires near 1% growth in either carbon emission and in resource use. And that's just a stylized fact. And because the current global primary energy supply is still heavily reliant on carbon intensive fossil fuels, cutting carbon emission implies degrowth. So that's basically their evidence and their reasoning and their proposal. So degrowth basically for the ecological economists, proponents of this degrowth idea, is that it is an inevitable result. Okay, if we want to implement carbon mitigation if we want to address the climate change crisis, they don't see any possibilities of a still growing economy, and particularly growing by the measure of GDP. And they are also very critical of the idea of decoupling. Basically, they're pointing out that if you want to decouple, meaning that you want to maintain economic growth, but with very low emission or completely decoupled from the fossil fuel energy, right? They're basically arguing that it is not possible as they can observe. And so far, any of the positive results are largely due to carbon leakage, as I just mentioned before. Of course, there are a lot of critiques to the degrowth school of thoughts. Some of the debates between degrowth and their critiques are listed here, as I will go over. I will highlight mostly the critique from the Green New Deal proponents, and also the more radical political economy approach in a minute. But I'm going to start with the Green New Deal critiques to degrowth. Mainly, the arguments are as follows. First, they're arguing that what we are seeing now, that growth, the 1% GDP growth requires near 1% energy use, and these energy use are mostly fossil fuel reliant, indeed is a problem, but it is because we're using fossil fuel. What we could do is to change the mindset and to think that we can replace fossil fuels with renewable. So as long as we can use renewables as a substitute for fossil fuels, then decouple is possible. Decouple energy, decouple carbon intensive resource use from economic growth is possible. So this is what the Green New Deal proponents would argue. Second thing they argue is that developing countries still need to grow to meet their basic energy need. So if you want to impose degrowth on those developing countries in underdeveloped regions, you're basically depriving their right of development, of gaining access to basic living standard, even basic electricity. So this is another really pretty important critique to the degrowth school of thought. Third point is an example that they often use, is Japanese example. Japan has been in recession for decades with very low growth, almost no growth, but at the same time, their carbon emission per capita is still very high. So they're using this example to show that the degrowth proponents' vision is incorrect, because Japan shows that if you have a very low growth model, basically you can even argue that it's zero growth or even negative growth, you could still maintain a very high carbon emission level. So these are some of the main critiques to the degrowth proponents from the Green New Deal school of thought. To these critiques, the degrowth proponents also have their own responses. For instance, about the replacement of fossil fuel with renewable energy, the response from the degrowth proponents is that even if we replace renewables, even if we use renewables to replace fossil fuels, the low energy returns on energy investment of renewables will restrain economic growth and still lead to a no growth state. So the idea is that the energy efficiency of renewable energy is very, very low, mostly because of the intermittency problem. For instance, sun is not always shining, right? Wind is not always blowing, as they always argue. So you have to store it. You have to invest in batteries. So far the battery technology is not well developed enough to help sustain the supply of electricity completely based on renewable energy, for instance, right? So all of these arguments led to the idea that even if we have a complete transition to renewable energy, the energy efficiency would be still very low, and therefore economic growth would still be restrained. And so in the end, we still need to, we're still going to end up in a no growth state. To the argument about developing country, global south, and their right to development, degrowth proponents' response is that degrowth strategy is going to be selectively implemented. And so only those economies that are already over-consuming carbon and energy are going to need to undergo this degrowth transition. And therefore, those extremely poor regions, extremely poor economies would not need to be worried about being imposed on the degrowth package, degrowth prescription. So that's their response. About Japan, the example, the degrowth proponents' response was that Japan was not actively seeking degrowth. It was actually in an economic recession as a result of internal contradictions of capitalism. And therefore, we see a stagnating economy, but still with high emission. And also the fact that Japan is within the global north shows that, which is also proved by empirical evidence, that income per capita is so far still the best predictor of carbon emission per capita. As you can see from this graph, right? It's not actually not economic growth and carbon emission that has this really strong statistical relation. Instead, it is the GDP per capita, the income, right? Which really predicts well the per capita emission. So the global north countries, mostly global north countries, right? You can see that they have a really high emission. And for Japan, as part of the global north club, even if they're in recession or economic stagnation, they're still at this level that the average income, the average carbon emission is really high. Okay. So as I said, previous critiques to the degrowth ideas mainly came from the Green New Deal proponents. So I think it will be probably worth the time to also introduce the Green New Deal idea, which is heavily influenced by the Keynesian school of thought, we can argue, and is often also categorized under the political economy approach. The Green New Deal, I think it's very important to realize that, first of all, it is a package used to address economic recession. It is a version of the New Deal. A New Deal was a program implemented in the 30s to address the Great Depression. And therefore, the core of New Deal at that time was to create employment opportunities through government interventions, and based on that, to create a positive feedback loop of rising real wages and effective demand, and therefore investment. And likewise, the Green New Deal was also calling for state interventions, and particularly industrial policies, to address the economic recession and the long-term issue of loss of manufacturing jobs in the global north. And therefore, in essence, it's more of an economic policy than an environmental policy. I think that's a really crucial point. It just happens to be that economic policy happens to be specifically about creating the so-called green jobs, right? That is in the renewable energy sector. There are critiques, lots of critiques to the Green New Deal idea as well, particularly from the radical political economy approach. For instance, one of the critique would be that within the domestic context, right? If we're looking only within the United States, for instance, the Green New Deal is indeed a progressive policy because it takes into account the domestic economic structure and is actually encouraging the use of industrial policies to tackle it. However, the same policies may appear technocratic once we take a global South perspective. What was missed in this framework is that, first of all, the power dynamics among countries were not explicitly discussed. The Green New Deal proposes that the wealthy countries need to send financial and technological support to the developing countries to support their own green energy development. So it's not that they are not thinking about countries in the global South, right? But the way that they approach the global South question is insufficient. But in reality, under the capitalist competition, first of all, technology is highly protected for monopoly rent. This 100 billion pledge made by the wealthy countries, right, that they would send every year to help the developing countries to develop their own green energy was never fulfilled. So that's something that was largely dismissed in the framework of the global Green New Deal. And second, the analysis is also insufficient in its reasoning with respect to the current global division of labor and race to the bottom pattern, race to the bottom mechanism, which would affect job quality to a large extent. For instance, without addressing the informality issue in the global South, meaning that a large share of employment, a large share of labor force is in the informal sector, right? Which means they're being underpaid with low wage and little social welfare protection. These are all the structural issues in the global South country. Without these issues being addressed, the global New Deal will end up just seeing that capital is going to pursue profit by going to places with loose environmental regulation and very much loose labor law as well. And therefore, research shows that I myself have also done some calculations. Like for instance, in China, right, we have actually both the technology as well as the financial capacity, you could argue, right, to develop renewable energy. And as a matter of fact, China is the largest renewable energy investor in the world right now, right? But the calculation shows that if the structural informality issue, for instance, is not addressed, you will see that more than half of the new employment being created from renewable energy transition will be eventually in the informal sector, right? So therefore, job quality issue is also really important. If the current division of labor, global division of labor, and this kind of overall race to the bottom capitalist competition mechanism does not change, then we will still see lots of other economic and social issues not coming with it. That's the critique to the global New Deal. There are also the radical political economist critique to degrowth, and particularly 2 points. First is that degrowth, as you can see here, is innately a product of the global North, and to some extent it actually resembles the global Green New Deal in its northern origin, and therefore it does not have a very detailed elaboration of its implications on the global South. Of course, the degrowth proponents are very clear in saying that the degrowth likely would not be implemented in the global South because most countries, most people in the South are not really over-consuming energy at all, right? But that explanation is largely insufficient as well, because the current global division of labor between the North and South means any policy implemented in the North will have repercussions in the South. So this needs more detailed elaborations. And so far, the degrowth proponents do not have a very clear vision of the South perspective. Also, a more important critique is that how can we envision an economy undergoing degrowth while at the same time avoiding getting into an economic crisis. All right. As we all know, if capitalism is the dominant logic, then a lower level of material abundance would mean not only a lower consumption level, right, which is good in some way because it reduces carbon consumption, but also it will reduce the production level and will have implications on investment and incentive and may lead to unemployment and recession. So this is something that degrowth proponents, many of the degrowth proponents, try to avoid discussing about the actual social relations of productions of the economy that they envision as this ideal degrowth economy. They're only talking about material throughput, lower material throughput, right? And emphasizing that even a low material throughput economy could also guarantee human well-being, human happiness. They use some survey to show the possibility, right? But they're not talking about the actual social relations of production at that time, right? For instance, they talk about reducing work time, right? How can we reduce work hours while make sure the workers are being paid sufficiently, right? So that they don't need to actually actively seeking opportunities to overwork and to make up the pay, right? So this is something that the radical political economy would argue that you need to actually be very explicit about the mode of production, about the social relations of production, to be able to have a more clear elaboration of a degrowth scenario. So this would be a critique to the degrowth school of thought. Sorry, just a sec. Okay. So now, after discussing all the limits of some of the approaches, the environmental approaches, ecological approaches, and we also talked about some versions of degrowth and its debates with the Green New Deal, I want to now shift the focus to the radical political economy approach and to show why this is a more thorough perspective that we can use to understand the problem of climate crisis. The approach, first of all, has an analysis of the economic logic that leads to the current climate crisis that we are seeing. The economic logic is mainly referring to the logic of capitalism, the idea that there's an imperative to endless accumulation of capital is driving capital to seek the race to the bottom strategy, reducing cost of production whenever possible, which leads to labor exploitation, public health crisis, and ecological destruction. And capital often seeks places with the least strict labor law and environmental regulation. And in that sense, right now, China being, for instance, the largest emitter of carbon, right, is mainly because of that, because China's role as the manufacturing hub in the world, right, which basically means this is not something unique to China or its political system, as a lot of scholars would like to point out, but whichever country that ended up being the manufacturing hub of the world, right? Nowadays, a lot of the discussion we see on New York Times and Financial Times are talking about the possibility of India taking China's place to become the next manufacturing hub, right? So what we should expect to see is that if we look at this phenomenon from the perspective of the political economy, you will know that whichever country that ended up taking this role, right, will end up emitting large amount of carbon and will end up showing extreme and severe labor exploitation, right? Just as what we are seeing now in China. So in that sense, we're focusing not just the nations, not just the country itself or its culture or its, all the other elements of the country, but rather the overall underlying logic that drives this phenomenon that we're observing here. And so as you can see, The ecological crisis is interrelated with capital's unchecked power to take advantage of the uneven development in the world. And by that, I was actually referring to the example of India. There were some reports recently about legislation reforms in India, in certain states in India, that legally extend work hours and overwork hours so that they can gain the favor of capital, foreign capital, to invest in those regions, right? So in that sense, we can even expect to see some retreat in progressive environmental regulations or labor policies in developing countries, if the priority is economic growth, if the priority is to create capital-friendly environment for foreign investment. So this is the economic logic. The historical perspective in the radical political economy approach is also crucial. Historically, as early as the 19th century, right? Marx has already been talking about what he termed at that time the metabolic rift between urban and rural agricultural sector during the process of industrialization and urbanization, where he was talking about how the produce of the nature was largely concentrated in the urban sector, leading to a lot of the urban waste and leaving a gap basically in the recycling back of the nutrients to the agricultural sector. So this is something that has been observed a long time ago, even centuries before. And later, as colonialism and imperialism proceeds, we see such rupture extends to distant regions that were brought into production to serve the interests of the capitalist core. And so that for this point, one example could be the guano trade from Peru, also in the 19th century, when the European capitalist agriculture hit a crisis due to declining fertility of the soil. It was argued that the guano, the bird droppings, can be used as fertilizers to enrich the soil in the European center, right? So what happened was that the millions of tons of guano were dug up in Peru by the Chinese coolies at that time, and exported to US and European nations. And this again was a typical example of this metabolic rift, in the sense that the soil conditions in Peru was severely worsened, right? So this kind of ecological, you can argue ecological imperialism, ecological colonialism, has been ongoing for a long time, for centuries. And therefore, this kind of historical dimension is really crucial in understanding the current climate crisis that we're seeing now. And the radical political economy approach does center that historical perspective, but not in a way to explain away the current responsibility of all countries, right, to contribute to make efforts to reduce carbon emission for today. But to also explain this kind of persistent inequality between the North and South, and to explain the current stalemate, the current distrust between North and South that we are seeing, that is preventing any possible collaboration among different countries, and particularly between the North and South. So I think that is also a very crucial contribution that the radical political economy approach is contributing for us to understand not only how the problem was caused, but also why we're still in this kind of stalemate. We're still in this kind of large dilemma here, where we see, the South and North does not really trust each other in fostering any type of collaboration, right? So it's already okay. So basically, I think I'm introducing these three approaches for us to understand the climate change question, because I think it's very important to know what are some of the ideas, what are some of the theoretical framework that we have used within academia, that we have used to tackle the question of ecological sustainability and to explain the crisis that we're in today. Because a good theory can really help you understand the root cause and points out where to go. But if the theory is problematic, if it's missing perspective, right? If it's, say, in neoclassical theory, the environmental economics, if it's just focusing on the power of the market and just focusing on finding the correct price, then we're really in the wrong direction in trying to find ways to address the problem that we're in. But we can also discuss in the Q&A later, right? That an immediate question that I can imagine would come up would be that, okay, the radical political economy approach is indeed very thorough in terms of its critique to capitalism, right? And it's in terms of its critique to all of the other more gradualist approaches to climate change. But how feasible is it politically, right? Do we have to wait until we have a political system change before we can even start to think about addressing the climate crisis, right? So I think this is definitely something that would be interesting to discuss later in the Q&A. I have also prepared this example of China's trajectories to carbon emission reduction, mostly from this one of the reading that I have sent earlier, written by a Utah professor, Ming-Chi Lee, who basically calculated the two possible trajectories of China to reduce its carbon, right? Where he talked about the two principles, one so-called inertia principle, the other equity principle, meaning that if we are to envision that in the future, okay, every human being in the world, the entire population on Earth, should have equal access to carbon usage, okay? While at the same time, we want to make sure that we do not overuse the remaining global carbon budget in the world. Then we need to implement the so-called equity principle. And under that principle, China's economy will need to experience negative growth rate of 2.3% in order to make that happen, okay, between year 2026 to 2100. Another principle is the so-called inertia principle, which basically divides the global carbon budget based on the current national share of the carbon emissions. So for instance, China now is the largest emitter, and therefore it will continue to be entitled, so-called entitled, to have access to that amount of that share of the carbon with the ultimate limits of the global carbon budget. If that is the case, China's GDP growth will need to be declining 2.4% for 2026 to 2100. So these actually shows that what we just talked about before, the ecological economists, degrowth proponents, observation was actually pretty much accurate, right? That the idea that if we want to actually follow the global carbon budget, make sure we don't go beyond that, then there's no way of envisioning a still rapidly growing economy, rapidly growing measured by GDP, right? So we really have to think about an alternative way to organize economy that at the same time guaranteeing people have basic access to living standard, to decent living standard, but not using high level of not using high level of material throughput, right? So in that sense, the GDP measure, we should not expect to see rapid growth in GDP measure. So this would be also something interested in discuss soon. And this is a graph of all the possible trajectory. And the main argument that Min-Chi Lee was trying to make in this article is that there's no way you can implement degrowth under the logic of capitalism, because it would definitely lead to economic crisis, economic recession. So you need to reorganize the economy by engaging some level of planning, right? So again, this is something that my own article, Planned Degrowth, also tackles some of the issue. But I think I'm gonna stop here and see where the questions would lead me to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ying, as expected, she gave us a lot to discuss, clearly presented. I have some questions, and I could have used my privilege as a chair here. I have two questions to ask, which have always bothered me. The first is this. There's an insight in Marx where he talks about the relation between capital and nature, which I've always found very useful. And Marx basically says that capital treats nature as an occupied country, foreign country. And the reason why it does that is because it takes from nature resources which are basically go towards value, and they're unaccounted for. It's like the bedrock of value, nature, and capital obtains that without any cost, and therefore it rapes nature. It treats nature as a resource that it can acquire for nothing. That to me sounds like a kind of externality. It sounds like an approach to economic accounting of inputs and so on, which basically says you don't account for it. It's free. It's external. And I do think that when I think about business and how it approaches nature, it is external to it. So is there any way in which we can think of that kind of fundamental radical Marxist way of approaching nature as having an analog with externalities and what they might mean? That's the first thing I want to ask. The second point I want to ask is this. Now, degrowth, I understand, and the need to reduce carbon emission according to the models and so on. When I think of degrowth as a political project, it strikes fear in me. The idea that in politics you can go out and try and get the working class or the poor or anybody like that in developed countries to support a degrowth project and call that, and you can do it as a political proposal and expect to have a majority behind you, is for the birds. It will never happen. So is there any way in which this, from a radical political economy perspective, can acquire more concrete meaning other than simply saying degrowth means restructuring the economy? Because that's like introducing socialism through the back door. Is there any way in which we can do that in a more effective manner? And I say this as someone who is personally interested in this, because I might have to approach people and talk to them about the environment very soon, politically. So how do we do it? What kind of message can we find that doesn't scare ordinary people and doesn't put them away from us?
Thank you, Kostas. These are really, really important and great question. I'll see if I can. I'll try to share my thoughts, but I'm not sure if I can sufficiently address it today. But this should be an ongoing conversation, I think. I think externality and what you mentioned about capitalism treats nature as as a free free gift, basically, right? That capital is basically freely expropriating nature, and as we can also argue, expropriating free unpaid labor, care labor, household labor. It's not exactly the same, I would think. I think the externality issue was trying to argue that, from the neoclassical perspective, is trying to explain away the responsibility of capitalism on ecological sustainability, right? The idea that this is not something that market or capitalism should be responsible for, because this is just created as a side product outside the overall kind of voluntary exchange process, which is perfect, which is most efficient, right? Based on the ideology. The Marxist approach, the radical political economy approach, I think Marx was observing what is happening now, that capital is expropriating all these natural resources, expropriating all these unpaid care labor to contribute to the accumulation of capital in the exchange sphere. But he's very critical of that arrangement, right? So he's observing it, but at the same time he's saying this shouldn't be the case, right? That these kind of the natural resources and as well as all these kind of unpaid care labor should also be treated seriously or equally. So I think there's some differences. I mean, although we could all say that there's some kind of externality, some kind of dichotomy that we're seeing here. One is within the system itself, one is outside of it. But I think the motivation and the rationale of using that terminology is very different from the neoclassical perspective versus the radical political economy. I don't think it sufficiently addresses it, but this is so far what I have. Okay. As for the degrowth one, I mean, I totally understand what you meant by the whether it being politically feasible at all. I was also, I think, discussing with some students just several weeks ago. I mean, I think I would also agree with Green New Deal as a good proposal, for instance, as a good policy package relative to inaction, complete inaction, like what we're observing now, right? But I think as a scholar, we need to really show and reveal the underlying problem and try to be as radical as possible to show the problem, to show the root cause of the problem, and to show the most radical solutions of what we are seeing today. But also understanding that in reality, in the political struggle, sometimes you ask more, but you meet in the middle, right? You make compromises in the middle. I mean, I think that's something that we all understand and agree on. I think to really talk about the degrowth as a political project, and to show working class in developed countries as well as in developing countries a vision of what the future would look like. I think what we could focus on is that we're talking about an economy that focuses on expansion of the so-called essential sector, right? Things that are actually meaningful to people's life, things like education, things like public health services. All these things would not only not degrowth, right, but actually expanded under a kind of a planned degrowth scenario. Because the idea is that we're going to get rid of the things that are redundant to the economy or parasitic to the economy, like the finance sector, for instance, right? That they're not really adding much value to the human well-being at all. But all these other things that are essential to the human well-being could actually be expanded. So in that sense, we're looking more of the use value of these services that are provided to the people instead of just exchange value, the commodified market value of these services. So I think this could be something that I mean, of course, I think activists could emphasize when introduce a degrowth scenario. But also, I think even the ecological economists discussion of degrowth that I was just showing that I'm critical of, but I think what they are saying is also very relatable to a lot of people, right? That the idea that you simply cannot envision an economy with sustainable ecological trajectory, but at the same time still experiencing rapid GDP growth. That's simply impossible. Simply by calculation, you can show that it's impossible. So therefore, we have to basically live under this kind of, in a way, rationed system, right? Rationed by the global carbon budget, and therefore the discussion should be, how do we ration it? How do we budget it? What do we use this kind of remaining little carbon budget? What things do we use it on, right? So I think people would see it more clearly. I think people are already seeing it very clearly, but they will see it more clearly as we see more extreme weather, as we see more of this kind of, climate crisis happening just around you. Not only before it was mostly in developing countries, like in poorer countries, right? But now it's also happening like in the metropolitan cities. We have floodings, we have all these kind of things that we see it every year. I think it will make it more relatable and understandable to people very soon. So of course, it's not just about introducing a scenario, a vision that is still far and distant from people, but the actual material condition change would also help people to understand it more.
Okay, I think.
Could I give? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean that's enough. I mean, yeah. Thanks very much for this. I didn't really mean to put you in an awkward position. These are very interesting answers. Anyway,
these are really important questions. Yes.
I think I jumped the gun a little. Anyway, abused my chair, my privilege as a chair. So I believe that Yanis has a more coherent set of questions to ask you and a more coherent set of comments to make. That would make more sense than what I've just asked. So let Yanis come in, and then we can open it up for Q&A.
I think actually it was a very interesting starting of a Q&A section, and there were some more theoretical and overlapping questions that are important for understanding probably the more concrete in a sense. So I think Professor Lobovitsas was a nice beginning. And then the presentation was very interesting. I think it touched upon many different aspects, and mostly it informed us about the very way of understanding how we analyze this issue at hand, which is the climate change crisis from different perspectives. I will become a bit more concrete. And I know that Professor Chen is really focusing on Chinese development and climate change policies, environmental policies. So the first question would actually make it a bit more concrete on this specific example. I mean, let's think of this. I mean, China is now the biggest economy in terms of purchasing power parity. It's the second most populated country. Although it's not historically, and that's something that is very important, the biggest carbon emitter, it is, in terms of current emissions, at the apex. I think it was after 2006 that this change happened, and correct if I'm not mistaken. But at the same time, and I mean, that was also mentioned in the presentation, it appears to be the top renewable energy investor. Just to give some numbers, $274 billion are invested, vis-a-vis Europe, which invests 56 billion, and the United States, which comes at around 50 billion. The differences are immense. Also, China is leading in net zero green energy manufacturing, as well as renewable energy production. I mean, if someone says the numbers is impressive in terms of how much energy is produced by renewables. And what is also important to mention is that by doing so, it also cheapens the green transition globally, not only for China, but for the world as a whole. Now, it's very interesting that we see in media focusing on this, what appears to be a paradox. And just to give you an example, in terms of the centrality of China in this climate change crisis debate, I will quote an opinion article that appeared later this year I think it was November, in New York Times. This comes from Pilita Clark. And she says, if you want to be hopeful about the world's chances of tackling climate change, look to China. If you want to feel desperate about the world's hopes of addressing climate change, though, also look to China. In other words, no country holds the fate of the planet's climate in its hands like China. So in a sense, it appears to be a form of paradox. On the one hand, the biggest emitter, on the other hand, the biggest renewable energy investor. And I would really be interested in learning more in terms of Professor Chen, if you actually consider this to be a paradox, first of all, and secondly, how can one understand the paradox based on the specific lens one takes to do so? So that would be, in a sense, I think, the major questions, because the other concerns were already addressed from Professor Lapavitsas, but we can always come to the eco-socialist alternative if we're interested. But that is the starting remark.
Sure, thank you. I'm actually working on a book manuscript that primarily aims to actually answer this question about whether what Yanis just mentioned should be considered as a paradox in terms of China's climate actions or inactions. So I think that instead of just treating these phenomenon as separate, right? On the one hand, China being the largest emitter, and on the other hand, China being the largest investors of renewable energy. Instead of treating them as separate things, as just contradictory policies from the policymakers, I actually see it as very much consistent. If we take the perspective of China's development model, especially in the past several decades, but especially since the 2000s after China joined the WTO. So in that sense, China being the largest carbon emitter really stems from the fact that it is assuming, as I said, the role of the world manufacturing hub, right? And note that the foreign capital invested in China precisely for its cheap labor and loose environmental regulation at the time. We can talk more about whether China's labor is really cheap. It is just cheap, or is it also like extremely effective, right? Based on the education level, the literacy level, health level at the time of its entry to WTO. That's another story. But that was the main motive for global capital, for foreign capital, actually starting from Taiwan and Hong Kong, who first invested in mainland China. But it was for profit, right? It was for profit and for the cheap, low cost of production that can take place within the mainland China. So the very second China accepts this role in a global division of labor, we should expect to see severe labor exploitation and ecological destruction. And just as all the previous manufacturing hubs had experienced, including Britain at the time of the Industrial Revolution. That's why we see actually, Marx was talking all about this metabolic rift even during that time. China's role as also the largest renewable energy investor, I think also should be seen as a developmentalist approach. It is basically industrial policy, decades of industrial policy, actually starting also with starting at the 2000s, right? Where the government started to invest in a solar panel, wind, and EVs, right? Right now it's becoming a big hit. The electronic vehicles also become a big hit. But it was a policy model following the East Asian development model, right? Policy that have been used by South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, or also the policies that lots of the heterodox economists are very much supportive of, right? Heterodox economists who are critical of neoliberal policies, for instance, like people like Chen, for instance, are very much supportive of this kind of developmentalist approach. So in that sense, I think it's more of a developmentalist approach rather than a remedy or a compensation to the ecological destruction. Even if so, it only comes as a secondary concern for Chinese policymakers. And therefore, the dominant guiding principle of the renewable energy investment is still very much profit-based. And therefore, we see in the beginning, solar panel production, for instance, was mainly for exports. to the European market at that time, because the domestic purchasing power was just not able to match up. The domestic market cannot really afford using the solar panels. It was only after 2007, after the economic recession, when the European market themselves cannot absorb the solar panels anymore, China started to shift to encourage domestic usage of solar panels with all the incentives and subsidies and policies and that. And therefore, if you look at the underlying economic logic, it's actually consistent. It's a consistent developmentalist trajectory China is proceeding. So in that sense, you can also argue that it's kind of like the Green New Deal, right? It's kind of like the perspective of Green New Deal that, you know, people scholars in the US and European countries are also arguing, right? It's coming more from an economic perspective, but it just happens to be a green products, renewable energy that were involved in that economic policy, economic packages. But for China, of course, it also has this kind of the development imperative, because, you know, it also wanted to address poverty and all that, right? But in the end, I think it's more of a developmental approach rather than an environmental policy. I think from that perspective, you would see that it's actually consistent instead of paradoxical.
All right. Might I push a bit more on the specific issue and connect it also this? You mentioned the article. Actually, we need to promote it because I think this issue is very important of monthly review. That is the July-August 2023 issue that many radical scholars actually engaged in a very interesting debate on this planned degrowth. And actually to connect it also with the question of Costas, I mean, how can we move in an eco-socialist, environmentally sustainable future? I mean, now we're talking about China. You also mentioned in your presentation this idea of inertia and equity scenarios. So maybe you can come back and perhaps say a bit more on that with respect to China. And the question to you would be, how can China, which is now at the core of the debate, or how do you see that the best way of moving forwards in terms of addressing the climate change from the perspective of China, both domestically but also internationally?
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Just to say, before you answer, as you answer, we can also collect questions to give the audience, give to the audience the ability also to engage.
Please do. Yeah, thank you for this question. I think it's very much connected to what Costas just asked, and I have to be very honest as a scholar about the limits of what a scholar can do. I think the theory that we are elaborating here, it's not a new theory, right? It has been argued over and over by a lot of the other scholars, contemporary scholars, but also, you know, scholars in the past, right? Exactly how that can be carried out really depends on, I mean, if we're talking about Marxist theory, right? I think we need to really include this kind of historical materialist view that the ideas can only be implemented when there are right material conditions. So I think now, if we look at now compared to versus 3-4 years ago, for instance, right, before COVID, right, I think there are a lot of dramatic shift in mindset with regard to how we can do work, for instance, right, how we can organize economy. I think this is going to happen also for the climate change case. We're going to see more and more climate disasters. We're going to see more and more incompetencies of nation states dealing with this kind of climate crisis collectively, right? Individually, right? So it would call for different ways of organizing economy, of fostering collaboration among all. And it would be largely pushed by both these kinds of material conditions of disasters and crisis, but also by climate activism. So I think, to be very honest, I think there's a limit of what we can do here. We can talk about the radical theory. We can introduce what is the best way to go forward. but eventually it will depend on the activists and politicians to actually carry it out. So I think this partly answers what Kostas was saying, but also to what you're saying here, Yanis, is that I think for the China example, we already see, I mean, by calculation, we can see that there's no way you can maintain high growth while at the same time reduce carbon to meet the global carbon budget criteria, right? And if China continues with the current developmental model, which is largely capitalist oriented, then what we can imagine is definitely recession, unemployment, and all this kind of crisis that are innately with capitalism. So you definitely need to organize a different social ownership of production. Is this something the policymakers are willing to do? Right? I mean, you don't know about this. It can be, right, if there's enough push, if there's a lot of climate activism. But if not, then the political structure will be in the way of carrying out a largely needed and largely necessary transition to a kind of sustainable. I mean, I actually don't really like the word sustainable, but just to say that, a kind of economy that we can envision that people can actually survive, first of all, right? And then also meet some of the basic living standards that are also, ecologically not destructive. So I don't think I can answer the question from a policy view, because it's not just a policy change, right? It does require some more fundamental changes to the way we organize the economy. But theoretically, I can argue that I think, as we have shown, degrowth, if you really want to implement it in an equitable way in both the global north and the global south, and also within each country in global north and within each country in global south, there's also class differences, right? So if we really want to organize it in a very equitable way, you do need to implement some kind of planning, right? And if you want to implement some kind of planning, you do need to, first of all, make sure there is a different public ownership. If it's a private ownership structure, what you can expect is, capital flight and, all of this kind of strike from the capital, right? So in that sense, you indeed need some basic political structure in place before you can carry out this kind of degrowth scenario. And of course, people would ask whether this is politically feasible at all, right? And I think this is also something that the Green New Deal, the global Green New Deal proponents would argue, is it feasible at all? And I guess my response is that, is Green New Deal feasible at all at today's political climate, right? Because even asking that, even making arguments developmentalist, you're meeting a lot of obstacles already, right? So even that is, you can maybe argue that it is politically infeasible, and therefore why don't we make the more radical demands and try to at least meet in the middle? So I think that's probably my response to that.
I mean, that's a fair answer. And essentially what you say is that social agency also matters, and that should be taken, it should consider as something very important, in a sense that it's not only the policy implications of our views, but also the politics implication of our views. So I think that's a very strong point. Now it's a moment that we allow for questions, reflections, and thoughts. That's always an interesting part. There was some discussion in the chat over this, quite a lot actually. So let's see. Just a favor, let's keep statements and questions short, maximum a minute, so we can allow for many people to actually share their thoughts. So I see a hand. And people can also post the questions in the chat. We also, the speakers can also, I mean, Kostas can always come back if he has more questions.
Maybe.
Maybe. All right. Okay. So let's give. Let's allow Ronald Kaliti to ask the question, make a statement, but keeping it brief. That is what we only request. How can we unmute? Now, let's see. Ask to unmute. Ronald, can you hear us?
Am I
Okay, now you can
unmuted?
speak.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. So since I'm in the presence of so many Marxists who might know something about the literature, I remember a lecture, decades ago by Kenley Dove, who pointed to a question that Marx raised in the Grundrisse, which is, what is to succeed capitalism? And as far as I remember, and I've looked everywhere to see if I could find the reference, couldn't. As far as I can remember, it's science. And so my question has to do with, well, I don't know if anybody's, World Bank includes forest reserves and mining potential in assessing the global environmental balance. And one thing that y'all haven't kind of mentioned, aside from climate, we have the problem of biodiversity. So basically what it boils down to is that we can't monetize, we can't assess the value of something we don't know about. That we don't actually have a statement of how many tons of carbon are torn out of the forest and go into the houses, and how much time is needed to replace it. A whole host of scientific questions that need to be brought together. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed for that AI will work out.
Okay,
But it's
so we have the first.
Is that a
We have the first question.
or is that a question? Can you?
Well, how do you? Yes, how do you negotiate from the dollar value of an externality to its real value? All we have so far is the economic value as opposed to the accounting value. And so to go beyond the accounting value, you need, there's all sorts of literature about it, long-term interest rate projections, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a difficult problem, but it can't be approached in my opinion, that's all I have to say, in dollar terms.
Okay, so here's what I think, right? I think trying to find the commodity value, to calculate the correct price of certain things, right? I think it's a dead end. I don't think it's gonna work. As I said in the lecture, this is the idea from the neoclassical economy that we need to find out the correct price and calculate the correct value, and therefore we can bring them into the market exchange, and therefore the market will help us, eventually reach to the equilibrium, the most efficient outcome, right? As you said, the unquantifiable are probably just unquantifiable. And if we want to try to quantify them and to try to put a price tag on them, there's just a huge debate on how you can do that. I mean, I gave the example of the carbon pricing in the literature. There's this whole range of price that scholars have proposed, and you can get stuck in this dead-end debate without actually, helping to actually address the actual question here. I think there's some really clear criteria based on science, as you mentioned, since you mentioned science, that we can use as a guiding principle to look at how to move forward. The global carbon budget, for instance, right? It's very clear how much carbon budget we still have. I mean, I think I still have the slides here I can show. For 2 Celsius degree scenario, we have about no more than 1.27 trillion tons from 2023 to 2100. That's it. That's basically what we have left with, right? And this is a very simple calculation. Even for like 3rd grade, they can do the calculation. We don't really need a fancy model to calculate the correct price of a fossil, the correct price of natural gas and oil, right? And to incentivize people or to disincentivize people so that they can make the correct choice. But just to look at what we have left, and look at how many people we have. What is the basic living standard each one has to have access to survive? It's a very simple answer, right? But it's just that there are so many political barriers for even introducing that idea, introducing that kind of calculation into the mainstream discourse on climate change, right? What we hear always is carbon trade mechanism, right? How do we tax carbon? How do we use the tax dollars to distribute and to, you know, in a way guiding people and motivate people to make more kind of environmentally friendly choices. I just feel like that's going to the wrong direction, and that's why I try to introduce all these different approaches and show what is the fundamental ideas behind all these policy proposals that we're hearing today, and to show why some of those proposals are really not leading us to anywhere. So I don't think this answers your question, but my understanding is that I don't think the effort should be put on to calculate correctly the unquantifiables.
All right, there is a question in the chat that also has to do with this measurement issue, but it takes the question from a different perspective. I'm gonna read it out. Just give me a second. So it comes from Sanders. I mean, you can also say it like Ying in the chat if you want, but I will read it loud for also the YouTube viewers. Regarding the equity principle, we are assuming every human as equal and then dividing the nationally apportioned carbon budget with a population count. What struck me was that in the numerator, we're taking the nationally apportioned carbon budget, which doesn't take every human being as equal. Parenthesis, as a nation is a historically contingent political formation, which mostly doesn't regard people outside of the nation as amounting to much. And in the denominator, taking population count a bit more objective sounding. Point. I think I understand the political implication of this equity perspective, but wanted to know how you think we can deal with this theoretical tension. So based on the equity principle and the nominator and denominator.
I'm not sure I entirely understand the point on numerator. Would you like to explain more? I don't know, Shantus, are you here? Would you like to explain? I understand the denominator part, but the numerator part, I'm not sure I understand exactly what the tension here is.
Yes, we can unmute you. Once. Okay, now you can speak, Chandra.
Hi, am I
Hello,
audible
hi.
now?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Yeah. So what I wanted to express is, as you mentioned, and it was also written in the slides, that the equity principle, it's at least based on an assumption that every human being is equal, and that's why it's named the equity principle. And so the way it deals with the carbon budgeting is it takes the nationally apportioned carbon budget, like that this much is for India, this much is for China, this much is for USA, based on the boundaries of the nation, the amount of production, the amount of consumption that is being done in the nation, right? So if I understood it correctly.
Oh no, actually, I think I understand your question. Actually, yeah. Can I try to answer, and maybe you can let me know
Please,
if I understand it correctly.
Yeah,
So,
please.
So actually, the inertia principle was based on what each country is currently emitting. So that was I think the point that you were trying to criticize about that there's already some unfairness going on there. But the the equity principle, you can actually see it. I think the explanation by Min-Chi Lee was a little bit more complicated than necessary, but a straightforward way to calculate the carbon emission based on equity principle is to just take the global carbon budget as the numerator and divide it by the entire population of the world. Do you see what I mean? So in that sense, each person, each human being would be considered as equal, and each country in the end will share the carbon emission according to their population. But in the end, everyone has access to the same amount of carbon. Does that address your question? I'll take that as
okay.
yes.
Yeah, we can continue. I mean, there can always be a response on the chat. So Juan here, I think, has her hands and raised. Okay.
Yes.
1 second. Sorry,
Oh.
Juan here. Let's unmute
Yeah,
Sandra
let's
so
go
we
back
can
to
close the
sure.
last question and then
No
move
worries.
to you. Okay. Let's unmute. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Sandra.
I understood it mostly correctly the last time you described the issue, but yeah, this time it became more clear when you gave this example that we are taking the whole of the world and the available carbon budget and dividing that by the population count of the world. But the issue which I wanted to stress upon in the question in the chat box is that even when we do that, I mean, can we say that it's truly kind of equitable? Because the carbon budget is based on some quote unquote objectively sounding scientific measurement, but the population count and the population dispersion in different parts of the world, it's based on different historical, institutional, political factors. So I mean, these issues are embedded there. So I just wanted to understand that how can we disentangle this theoretical tension? Yeah.
I see what you mean. I see what you mean. Yeah. So for instance, if people living in certain regions which are, I don't know, like climately more inclined to disasters might actually need to have more infrastructure, for instance, to protect them from being the victims of climate crisis, and therefore they might actually need more carbon emission, right? Need to consume more carbon in order to just access their basic living standard, right? Things like that. Or you can even argue that adult versus a child, they might also need to, consume carbon on a very different scale. So I completely agree with that. I think that's a very good point. That just equal distribution per capita itself might not be ultimately at equity, reaching the equity principle. So there should be more discussion on what everyone need, right? Distribution by need in that sense. Well, I would certainly agree with that critique. Yeah, but right now the problem is that we haven't even reached the first step of agreement, which is to even use the global carbon budget as a guiding principle to make any kind of distribution. But your point is very well taken.
All right, Juan, now it's your turn.
Yes, thank you very much, Ying, Yanis, and everyone who participated. So my question, I think, is also kind of like related to Chanda's question as well, in a way. So what I see in the debates of like climate crisis is that often the unit of analysis is either nation-based or like very individualistic. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but like that degrowth narrative has also affected that like individual-based approach of like veganism, for example, the consumers boycotting and things like that. And I feel like there's something missing. From my perspective, it's quite important to bring in the class dynamic of, because even within the so-called first world countries, there certainly are like capitalists or like transnational corporations versus just the working class. So do you see how do you think this perspective can be like incorporated into the policy discussions, or like do you see the importance, or like if you do, how do you think it can be sort of incorporated together? Thank you.
Thank you so much, honey. This is actually a very crucial point. I try to discuss some of these issues in my article, but I didn't get a chance to actually discuss in detail in today's lecture. I think you pointed out really important point that degrowth can have production side implications, as what we just discussed about planned degrowth, try to completely change the production structure, but on the other hand, you're pointing at the other implication of degrowth, which is more consumption based, which we often hear about, how individuals need to make ethical consumption, need to be responsible for their own consumption and try to consume environmentally friendly goods, and that's also considered as degrowth, right? And to that, actually, I think in my article, I try to highlight a really alarming point, which is a lot of the global North scholars are trying to argue that the global South countries with their big populations really need to restrain their consumption, because if they're consuming the way we are, then there's no cure for climate change, for climate crisis anymore, right? There's no cure for environmental sustainability anymore. So I think in my article, I tried to actually point out that inclination of degrowth arguments, which I said was potentially Malthusian, right? The argument that the global South people need to either control their population growth or at the same time control their consumption, right? While at the same time in the North, the policy was mainly about how to nudge the people to consume a little bit more environmentally friendly, right? So we can see this kind of discrepancy for sure. So I think it's really important that you mentioned that. I think the kind of degrowth that I am more in favor of has to involve the discussion of mode of production. So it's not just consumption. The consumption part, I would say, most liberals like to talk about, because it doesn't really touch about the overall economic structure at all, right? It's all about individual behavior, individuals having access to all the information. Therefore, you can make the wise call of what to produce, what to consume. And at the same time, I think it also contains this idea that price is being reflected. The environmental part, the ecological consciousness part was also reflected in the price, just like how consumers were encouraged to purchase fair trade goods, which are a little bit pricey, right? So it became all kind of individualistic, consumer-oriented solution, which of course is not sufficient, because whatever consumers can buy from the market is decided by what is being produced, right? So you definitely have to incorporate the production side of the story as well. And of course, what you mentioned about a class perspective definitely is very crucial. I have written, actually co-authored an article that shows that, say within China, within India, if we're looking at the top 1%, the top 0.1% of the income class carbon emission, it's sometimes parallel to maybe the middle class in the global North country, right? So it's not just the nation states hierarchy that we're observing, inequality that we're observing, but within country, actually, there's also severe inequality with respect to their access to carbon emission energy consumption. Did I answer your question? Was there anything I missed?
Yeah, no, that was really good. I guess if I mentioned explain myself further on one thing, I guess I wanted to know a little bit more as well about the what's being done to especially I'm thinking multinational corporations, because a lot of the times they are richer than poorer countries as well, and
I see.
their operation very much goes way beyond the national borders. So how do you see we can tackle the operations of these big global businesses? Yeah, if that makes sense. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Okay, I see what you mean. So basically you're saying that in addition to nation state or individuals, households as unit of analysis, maybe we should also look at corporations, right? Because they are probably more carbon responsible than a lot of the individuals putting together. Of course, I agree. I think that is consistent with the production side of the story, right? Because, you know, if we're talking about how these multinational corporations are responsible for carbon emission, a lot has to do with what they choose to produce and what they are allowed to produce, right? So that's definitely related to the capital regulation, which again goes back to what we talked about, the political feasibility, right? If we want to talk about, like right now, we can't even see government and state have the power to regulate these multinational corporations. So right, so in that sense, if we're trying to envision a more radical scenario, it has to come from below, come from the grassroots and climate activism, instead of relying more from the policy making. At least that's what my take is.
All right, so two very nice questions and responses. I'm actually going to take Yorgos Piscina's question. I know that Yorgos is also working on the political economy approaches to ecology and nature. So the question is also very good, I think. Can the approach of universal basic services serve as a better political framework than degrowth? I think it somehow addresses both the mode of production and mode of consumption that somehow degrowth criticizes.
Can Yorgos introduce the universal basic services maybe? So that I can also get a clear idea of what you mean and the audience can also understand before we discuss.
Yoro, you have an invitation to speak. I'm not sure if you can. Can you write in the chat?
Hello.
Okay,
Yes. I don't know. I don't know if I'm well suited to present the universal basic services idea, but I think it was something discussed in the previous decade, and it was proposed by both feminist political economists and advocates of the Green New Deal as a different approach than the universal basic income approach and minimum wages approach and all that, because it addresses the same issue of basic needs of the population, but does not require them to get their stuff through the market, but are provided as a universal basic service. So let's say I am from Greece, and in Greece we used to have a free education system, and that was a universal basic service approach. So could something like that be utilized as a political agenda serving the degrowth approach? That was the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I definitely have to read more about the detailed packages coming with the universal basic services, but my immediate instincts are that, is it going to be distributed based on nation states? Because if that's the case, each nations will have different amount of economic surplus, and therefore the service that they can distribute to their own citizens would be very different, right? I've actually written something about the universal basic income, where I was also arguing that it's very much North-centric. It's kind of leaving out also a majority of the population in the world, the global South. If we're talking about nation state, we're talking about countries with very little economic surplus. What they can access as universal income or universal basic services would be a lot smaller, a lot lower, negligible than what maybe the global North can achieve, right? So is that equity problem also an issue we need to think about? So I think in that sense, this is a distributive policy, right? What you're talking about is a distributive proposal. It doesn't really change the overall mode of production. It doesn't really change what each country produces. It doesn't really change the global division of labor. It doesn't really change the profit margin each countries can have access to, depending on their position on the global value chain today, right? If that doesn't change, it would mean the basic amount of economic surplus that each countries can extract would be very different. And therefore, what they can distribute to their citizens would be very different. So that kind of inequality would, again, perpetuates. So I think that's my instincts. But of course, I have to read more. Maybe there are more in the proposal that I'm not familiar with.
I think to be fair,
I mean,
I think to be fair on this one,
No.
much of the emphasis is universal basic services. The emphasis on use value rather than on value.
Then in just the income. And
Which
then
is-
they have
yeah.
to go to the market again, right? I agree. This
But-
sounds much better than universal basic income. Yeah.
Yeah. So therefore, it would attract restructuring of the economy on the basis of use value, which is another way of saying socialism.
No, in that sense, of course, I agree. Yeah.
okay. Actually, if we don't have any other questions, I have a question, which we have already discussed with Ying. So we have, I think, 10 more minutes to do so.
I have a question. I have a question.
Go on, please.
No.
Go on, please.
You ask yours first, and I'll ask.
Okay.
I'm gonna be quick. So let's think of the international dimension, right? We see and this global north and global south. What we actually see is now the responses of the global north in terms of green manufacturing is a violent form of protectionism that in a sense is also self-defeating. The main idea is how to bring back industry into the core and how to do so in this kind of very competitive new technologies that are also supposedly ecologically friendly. How can one understand what is happening, and what do you think are the repercussions or the outcomes of this new, as I think we've discussed, greening capitalism? With green capitalism, because essentially protectionism is a form of competition on its own.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I think this really is another example of why the capitalist framework cannot really address the climate crisis at all on the global scale, right? Before we talked about how the Green New Deal, the global Green New Deal proponents was saying that we can actually make some changes, make some revisions, make some technological investment within the capitalist framework. And as long as we have the technologies, meaning green energy, renewables, right, we can actually transition the economy into a sustainable kind of foundation, right? That was the main argument. I mean, we can also be very sharp and say it's a technocratic argument because it doesn't really require any changes in social relations of production, right? But what you're just saying was actually a perfect example of how that even doesn't work. China, for instance, has invested huge amount of money into the development of solar energy. And I think, Yannis, you mentioned that because of the economies of scale of production in China, right? Solar, wind, and all these renewable energy are now becoming even more cost effective than coal, than the fossil fuel. So it's actually supposed to be a very optimistic scenario to look forward to, because now the technology is in place, even the cost was brought down. So in a normal scenario, we would expect all these technology to be spread around the world and everyone gets to enjoy the renewable energy and have a transition to the green economy, right? But look what happened is that because of competition, which is really the core of capitalism, because of competition, because of this profit-oriented kind of competitive inclination, we see countries trying to impose tariffs on solar panel imports, right? Because they want to take the market share. Not to say this is not to put any moral blame on the countries putting tariffs, but this is actually precisely what capitalists are expected to do, because they don't want another country to take the entire market share of solar panel, of renewable energy in the world. So they have to do something, right? So you're talking about the protectionist policies. And so basically the technology was prevented from being spreaded more quickly as we would like to, right? So I think this really shows the limits of the technocratic solution. Even the technology is in place, even the finance is in place, there are so much political barrier as a result of the working logic of capitalism that would, would dilute and diffuse all these benefits, potential benefits of technology. So I think that's definitely a very important alarm and lesson of trying to work within capitalism and see the limits of it. Another thing, you're asking me, what do I think is the possible outcome of this competition? I think, as at least I would imagine that, say for China, if it is not able to have access to markets in the global north, then it will definitely try to expand its economic activities in the global south even more, right? So the BRI project, the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, we would probably expect to see it kind of, happening in a larger scale. But at the same time, you also see European markets and US is trying to come up with alternative, BRI-like initiatives as well. So they're trying to compete on that market as well. So yeah, so I think we're gonna just see a lot of the fierce competition. And what I worry is that all these competition, again, will lead to the kind of profit-oriented investment, and this kind of race to the bottom mechanism would be in place again, and might even lead to a lot of the ecological issue backfire again. So that's something that I'm really worried about.
We can't hear you, Yanni.
I can't hear you, sorry.
So I say that we started the Q&A section with the 2 questions of Kostas, and we're closing today's lectures with Kostas' question and Ying's response.
I'll ask a simple question. I'm sure the answer is not simple at all, but I'll ask a question that it really is troubling me. And it is this. I'll make it concrete. And it has to do with how to use degrowth, what sense to make of degrowth as an active policy. Now, where I come from in northern Greece, there is a lot of electricity production. The electricity production is based on brown coal. It's the worst coal you can use. Germany uses a lot more, incidentally, but that's another story. So electricity production works on the basis of brown coal is terrible, right? In terms of the effect for the climate, the environment, the people who work there, you name it. But it's a very big employer. And it's the main producer of electricity for the country. On the other side of the mountain is my house. And that creates problems. But anyway, what they're proposing to do now is put a series of these wind turbines on top of the mountain. They're going to close down the brown coal using facility or limit it, and then replace it with these wind turbines, which they're going to put along the mountaintop. What's the degrowth proposal on this? What do we say? I mean, what exactly? I mean, what position does one take on this? Is it green? Is this what we're after? That they should close the brown coal using capacity and make these people redundant, and replace that with these wind turbines on top of the hill, which are obviously polluting the hill, right? Although they're not polluting in the sense of CO2, presumably. And if we're not in favor of one, nor in favor of the other, what are we in favor of? I mean, what is the argument here? What do we say? We need less energy? We need more wind turbines somewhere else? I'm genuinely, I mean, I don't expect a direct answer here. I just want to see what your sense is in terms of the degrowth strategy and how one should position oneself in this. What's the radical position on it?
Okay. First of all, I have to emphasize that I don't think degrowth could be a policy reform. It really requires a fundamental shift of the economic structure, right? So I think you already touched upon what I was trying to say. One of the things I was trying to say is that I think the technocratic solution from the Green New Deal was to take energy demand as static. We're basically just changing the energy supply, replacing fossil fuel with renewable energy, right? But if people's household consumption, electricity consumption keeps increasing, it's not their business, it's not their problem. I think this is also something China is facing now because of its overall fast development trajectory, like, you know, extremely fast growth and the overall consumerism that is ongoing in the country. Energy demand is just rising rapidly. And therefore, China could never promise to really phase out coal as quickly as it can, because there's always a moment that you will see that energy demand is not being sufficiently met. Because the renewable energies are intermittent. They can't guarantee it to be in place all the time, 24 hours a day, right? So in that sense, I think the supply side and the energy and the demand side need to be in the part of the story altogether. And that requires a fundamental shift of the economic model itself. I think you probably are also implying the labor implications of phasing out coals as well, right? And this is something that was debated in the United States as well, especially a lot of the coal workers or coal mining workers are actually unionized. So it's a very difficult questions to make, difficult argument for people on the left to make. Again, I think this would be very hard to. Under capitalism, you can argue that there could be some policies about re-employment, providing retraining skills to make sure that these people, after they leave the coal mining industry, can have sufficient skills to move to other industries, like the renewable energy or other industry. I think that's what the US Green New Deal proponents are arguing for. But this would be very hard to imagine in global South country, in developing country. Basically, if you're gone, you're gone, right? If you're fired, you're fired. You have to find another type of job by yourself. So I think that, again, will require a different mode of production, an economy that guarantees employment, guarantees jobs to everyone. I mean, maybe in capitalism, you can even, there are people arguing federal job guarantees, right? But I mean, socialism is supposed to guarantee full employment to all. So the kind of retraining, providing new skills for transition to new jobs should be part of the process of this restructuring of the economy. So I think, again, that this would mean degrowth is not just a simple policy that we can make. It really requires a complete overhaul of the existing system and some other all like comprehensive readjustment, right, to make sure it actually works. Wind turbines on the hill, I understand the critique, right? I understand the critique that even by building solar panels, installing wind turbines, there are birds getting caught in the wind turbines, and solar panels, you still need plastic, steels, that all requires fossil fuel, being part of the production process. But I think I think again, this goes back to the carbon budget. How do you really use it, right? And that this would require some really comprehensive overview of what the economy needs. I think that if this is really needed, if this can really sustain electricity demand in the long run, in a green way, in a renewable way, probably that little bit of fossil fuel investment is necessary. I don't think we should make it, completely, problematic, right? Just because it has a little bit of a coal investment, a fossil fuel investment in the production process. If in the long run, right, the renewable transition can be in place and can sustain. So, but that's, I think, that's something that requires some careful planning and careful calculation on whether it's worth it or not. I know, this is all just speaking in abstract, but
no, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. I didn't expect. I just want to give you a sense.
No, I understand the complication for sure.
The politics here.
Yeah.
See, you present something as a radical, and so it is. Yeah. But you try and make that radical politics in the here and now. See how difficult it is. Because what you're telling me is, I accept that.
Yeah. But how to do it? Step one, right? Yeah. Right. I understand. But regarding the labor implication, actually, I think in the U.S., the Green New Deal proponents, what scholars do here is to calculate the labor intensity of fossil fuel investment and Green New Deal investment. And basically, the data shows that across the globe, renewable energy productions are more labor intensive, and therefore, by investing at the same level to fossil fuel industry versus to renewable energy industry, you should expect to see more employment being generated from the green energy. You probably are very familiar with this kind of work, but that's at least a response to the labor argument. But there are so many other arguments. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Costa, are you bringing it to a close?
Oh, right. Yeah, sorry, I lost track. Yeah. All right. I think we've had I've had a very interesting discussion.
Me too. Yeah, we should continue the conversation for sure.
We've had a very interesting presentation on a very topical issue. Ying delivered it with customary depth and sophistication. So I think we're all leaving it a little bit wiser than before. And this is going to run and run. I don't think it's going to be exhausted anytime soon. So I'd like to thank Ying for this and bring the session to a close for all of us. I would only like to remind you that the last session of this series is on the 18th, I believe. And Yanis Davermos is going to introduce on monetary and fiscal policies for a green transition. So we will continue to explore the issue in our next session. So thank you very much. Thank you to Ying. And have a good evening or a good day, wherever you are.
Thank you, Kostas, and thank you, Yanis, for all the great discussing questions, and Hani too for your question. Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.